The year is 2014. Steve Fukuda, the lead designer at Infinity Ward, decides he's had enough of Call of Duty. He's been working on Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1 and 2 for the last 6 years, and now he's moved on to a new small studio called Respawn Games. Steve's brought in to be the game's director, and they want a brand new franchise from him. They'll call it Titanfall. EA publishes Titanfall on March 11th, 2014, and it's a huge success. Not as successful as Modern Warfare 1 or 2, but successful for Respawn's first game. EA sees the money rolling in, and Respawn asks him for a sequel, this time with a story. You see, Titanfall 1 didn't have much of a story. Its main focus was on the gameplay, but Respawn knows what Steve is capable of. Modern Warfare's campaigns were highly acclaimed, and they want him to write something special for Titanfall 2. The game follows Jack Cooper, a rifleman for the Frontier Militia and the player character. The Frontier Militia is a group of rebels responsible for defending the frontier, a vast region of space and home to many. The Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation, or IMC, is a massive industrial conglomerate. They want to colonize the frontier and exploit their resources for sweet profit. Cooper's main goal is to stop the IMC and to protect his home. Overall, a simple concept, very akin to other sci-fi series like Star Wars, but Steve has a trick up his sleeve when writing Titanfall. The Titans. They're big, they're strong, and as the name indicates, they fall. Absolutely brilliant. In the Titanfall universe, pilots are special soldiers given access to these Titans among other tools, but it's really all about the Titans. Throughout the game, Jack encounters many of these pilots, each with a special Titan and an equally special personality. In the beginning of the game, Jack Cooper, the player, is a regular rifleman, pretty low on the military food chain, but he is mentored by Captain Ty Lastimosa, a pilot in the militia. Lastimosa is in charge of a Titan called BT-7247, a Vanguard class Titan. Ty Lastimosa mentors Jack in the beginning of the game until, spoilers, he dies. He gives BT-7247 to Cooper and he officially becomes a pilot. Jack is placed under the command of Sarah Briggs, another commander in the Frontier Militia and the person who gives Cooper his missions throughout the game. The most important of these characters is definitely BT, the secondary protagonist and the best character in the game. His AI is linked to Cooper after Lastimosa dies, and BT gives Cooper the mission that Lastimosa failed to complete. Their main mission is to rescue this guy, Major Eli Anderson, another pilot in the Frontier Militia. Overall, the protagonists of this game, aside from BT, are relatively boring, but the main character engagement comes in the form of the antagonists you meet throughout the game, and there's a lot. The main antagonist is Elias Martyr, a general for the IMC. He's also a little bitch and doesn't show up physically throughout the entire game. Instead, he uses his evil superpowers to hire these guys, the Apex Predators. The Apex Predators are a group of mercenaries who have been contracted by Martyr to defeat the Frontier Militia. Their leader is this guy, Cuban Blisk, a mercenary pilot and one of the commanders of the IMC. His primary motivation is money, stemming from the political corruption he watched growing up. Since Elias has the most money to offer him, he works for the IMC and tries to kill Cooper throughout the game. For those of you who play Apex Legends, he is very important for the game's lore, which I'll get into later on. A character from Apex that you might recognize is Dr. Ashley Reed, or Ash. She was formerly a doctor, but after an injury during a battle, she transferred her consciousness into a robotic body, and now she's a pilot fighting alongside Blisk. She's also motivated by money, but is very egotistical and values combat ability greatly. Another character with a connection to Apex Legends is Viper. He's another pilot in the Apex Predators, and his primary characteristic is that he likes to fly. He's also Valkyrie's father, which serves as his main motivation, to gain money and provide and protect her. What a good father. This is Richter. He is a very interesting guy. He is also a mercenary pilot in the Apex Predators, but he also likes cutting people's ears off. A very angry guy you probably don't want to mess with. This is Kane. I think you get the point by now. Mercenary pilot, violent and angry, but he's also addicted to drugs, which is like most of his personality. Finally, we have Sloan, another violent mercenary, but she's slightly more important than the rest of them. Besides Blisk. Again, spoilers, she's the final boss of the game, but she's essentially just like the rest of them. Violent, cruel, and will do anything for money. Overall, somewhat similar in terms of archetype and motivation, but they do all have defining traits that make them interesting. Since most of the interactions with characters is through dialogue and fighting, heavy emphasis was placed on the voice lines of the enemies being directly relayed to the player. Which is exactly how I'll be telling you the story. The game starts by introducing the player to Ty Lastimosa, a captain and pilot in the Frontier Militia. He gives Cooper a brief overview of the conflict between the Frontier and the IMC. After giving the player the lore dump about the war, Lastimosa brings Cooper to a simulated reality. He teaches Cooper about how to be a pilot and lets him participate in the gauntlet. It's basically a speedrun course, but it gives the player some early context on how the game is played and how much skill it takes to be good at it. Comparing my first score to Lastimosa's, it wasn't particularly close. Even with a couple of good attempts, I wasn't nearly as good as the people at the top of the leaderboard. It's a good reference for how quote-unquote unskilled the player is. Once the player exits the gauntlet, they are introduced to the primary conflict of the game. The MCS James McAllen is ambushed and lands on the planet Typhon. Cooper is sent out in an escape pod and lands on Typhon. After waking up in the escape pod, Cooper is forced to fight alongside other soldiers, and after some time, they're ambushed by a Titan. This is the player's first real exposure to the Titans, and it's honestly kind of terrifying. It just drops from the sky and attacks the player. Cooper almost dies, but he's saved by Lastimosin BT7247. That is, until not even 20 minutes into the game, and the guy who taught you everything you need to know is just dead. But before he dies, he gives you BT and says, "You're a pilot now," before kicking the bucket. Narratively, it's a message to the player that anyone can die at any point and that no one is safe. Usually in games, I find it weird that important characters don't die very often, but Titanfall strays from that and creates a moment that really sticks with the player. After collecting some batteries, the player goes and repairs BT. BT tells the player they need to finish what Lastimosa started and meet up with Commander Eli Anderson about something. I don't know. Most of the game hinges on trying to meet up with this guy, so he must be important, right? Anyways, the two go into this sludge factory and get separated from each other. Narratively, this section isn't super significant, but it gives us these little dialogue moments between BT and Cooper. It helps to grow and establish their new relationship and connection, while also giving personality to the two characters. While Cooper and BT have their conversation, Kane also establishes his presence in the factory. He has little pieces of dialogue in the form of announcements made over a PA system, which are violent and threatening, and also build anticipation for the boss fight at the end of the factory section. So BT and Cooper fight Kane, Kane dies, and the player steals the radio from inside of Kane's helmet. This gives Cooper a huge advantage over the IMC now because he has insider information, just like Nancy Pelosi. Cooper spends a moment listening into a conversation between Blisk and Sloan, and then this happens.
Got myself 3 captured militia. What should I do with them?
Just kill him.
The scene is very cruel and really communicates to the player how violent these people are. The lack of visuals to accompany the dialogue really leaves the brutality to the imagination and makes these characters interesting in a very simple way. After this traumatic experience, Cooper and BT go into a factory, where they become separated and have to navigate their way to safety. Sounds kind of familiar, but I digress. BT is yoinked by a mechanism in the factory, and Cooper must reunite with him to continue their mission. This section is the hardest by far in the entire game. These little ticks are scattered everywhere, and they do not leave you alone. They'll just appear next to you and kill you instantly. They're little spawns of Satan, and I hate them, and I wish they would die and be permanently removed from this world. In terms of narrative, this section is similar to the last one. Cooper navigates through some factory building, and the dialogue of another character plays in the background. This time though, it's Ash. She has a very cold and harsh demeanor that makes Cooper uneasy, but she also has this underlying confidence which connects her personality to the apex predators. When Cooper escapes the factory, he fights Ash alongside BT and eventually defeats her, but I'm not gonna lie, this was probably the most underwhelming fight of the entire game. This section builds so much anticipation, and I'm not sure if it was the Titan I was using, but I beat her in like 4 seconds. It could just be a skill issue. After the fight with Ash, Cooper and BT once again escape the factory, but this time they actually finish the mission and meet up with Major Anderson. Well, half of Major Anderson at least. You see, the game frames the mission as this rendezvous with Major Anderson, implying that he's still alive, but when you make it to the laboratory that he's located, he's just like stuck in the floor. As Cooper navigates the rest of the laboratory, time is warped and Cooper randomly travels back and forth between the past and the present. He also finds Anderson's other half, which has this watch attached to it, and it gives Cooper the ability to travel back and forth at will. Cooper uses this power to travel into the past as he discovers the IMC's secret weapon called the Fold Weapon. It's this big device that causes mass destruction to entire planets. Cooper follows a hologram of Anderson's past as he also discovers the weapon, with a new mission to stop the IMC and destroy the Fold Weapon. The main power source for the Fold Weapon is this, an arc. It's this weird ball of time energy, I think. It's also just in the laboratory with them in the past, maybe? It's kind of confusing, but BT and Cooper have to catch up with the transporting ship, scan the arc, and destroy it. This section is super narratively heavy and has a lot of important details about the IMC and their colonizing tendencies, but most of the lore is from the perspective of the past. However, there's tons of guards and enemies all over the place, which provides an interesting contrast of, I want to know more about the game, but the more time I spend in the past, the riskier it is. It provides motivation to the player to improve at the game by providing them narrative clues and information in exchange for developing skill. Once Cooper and BT make the discovery, they head back to a militia base and try to contact Commander Briggs about the Fold Weapon. They make it back to the base, but the base is out of power and they're unable to contact the main Frontier militia control system. Cooper has to go into the mines to get this thing called the Arc Tool to fix the base. As far as I'm aware, the Arc Tool actually isn't connected to the Arc at all. It's just called something similar, but also has similar powers of energy production. Cooper goes and uses it to fix a satellite and send out a beacon. Then at the end of the section, Richter just appears and Cooper beats the shit out of him. Cooper and BT contact Commander Briggs and they reunite with each other. Cooper and BT tell Briggs about the fold weapon and the Ark, and they decide to go after a carrier ship containing a second Ark. They chase after it in this grounded section and miss the opportunity to stop the ship before it leaves. Then the militia chase after the ship through the sky and hijack another ship to reach it. Viper appears to stop Cooper from making it to the ship, but Viper dies and Cooper successfully makes it. Once they make it to the Ark, the ship begins to crumble around them and fire erupts from within the ship. They retrieve the Ark, but BT makes the decision to use his body to protect Cooper. The ship crashes and everything goes dark. Cooper wakes up to BT in ruins, and Blisk and Sloan threaten him to give up the Ark. BT tries to fight them, but Sloan shoots him in the stomach and takes the Ark for herself. It's a very dark scene in which you practically just watch BT die, but he does manage to hang on just enough to tell you about the Seri kit located inside of his head. It contains his AI consciousness along with a couple other tools, one of which is the Smart Pistol MK6. It's just a gun with aimbot, but it provides this narrative to gameplay contrast, which I find super interesting. It changes the way power fantasy is perceived, and because the player has all of the power, but narratively, Cooper is at his lowest without BT, it provides an interesting contrast between the gameplay and the narrative. Eventually, Cooper is able to escape with BT's consciousness and call in another Titan to replace BT, and because they can't just kill off BT, they replace the new Titan's conscious with BT's old one. Eventually, Cooper and BT make their way to the fold weapon, which is being held inside of the stronghold. They make their way inside, encounter Sloan, kill Sloan, and then try to stop the fold weapon from destroying the frontier. They attempt to destroy it and it fails initially, launching them backwards and temporarily disabling BT. Blisk appears above them, but instead of killing them, he decides to spare them and gives them an invite to the Apex Predators. It's this little moment in the climax of the game, but it's super important to Blisk's character as it shows his motivations aren't truly evil. He does his job for the money and nothing more. BT eventually recovers and the two launch themselves into the fold weapon to destroy it. But being BT, he can't let Cooper die. It's in his protocol, which I purposefully neglected to mention because it's a big point in the game. His 3 protocols are to link to the pilot, to uphold the mission, and protect the pilot. It's a big point in the game that's mentioned several times, but I purposefully avoided mentioning it because it's so important to this final scene. As BT and Cooper make their way inside of the fold weapon, these protocols appear on screen, and as the third one appears to protect the pilot, BT rips Cooper out of the cockpit and throws him to safety. It's BT's final sacrifice. When I said that BT can't die, I lied. He actually does die in this final scene, and as BT sacrifices himself, the fold weapon explodes and creates this environment of floating debris around Cooper. Briggs is able to contact Cooper through his headset and manages to successfully save him, but BT is dead and he never comes back. The final moments of the game are Cooper having an inner monologue about the frontier and the people and the noble sacrifice that BT has made. It's a moment that really makes the player reflect about the story, and even though the game is relatively short, being only 6 hours long, it's a super eventful journey and it shows how much BT really meant to Cooper. Titanfall 2 really is an experience unlike any other I've played, and although it has some ties and inspirations to other sci-fi stories, it manages to create a world with unique characters and interesting narrative elements. To me, the strongest element of the game is the use of death to invoke emotion in the player. Lastimosa's death invokes a sense of panic in the player, and it almost feels like a betrayal from the developers. The person who's been primed to guide the player throughout the story has just been ripped away from you. It almost makes the player feel alone and unassisted. The new connection of the guiding figure is now placed on BT, but again, you spend most of the game isolated from BT. It forces the player to develop on their own, and it builds the relationship of Cooper and BT through the dialogue. Cooper's development and the player's development is solely placed on them, and it doesn't really handhold you through the experience. Again, this element of death is prevalent at the end of the game when BT makes the sacrifice to stop the fold weapon. It invokes a sense of loss and grief as you've lost the only real character that Cooper has made a connection with throughout the game. People become emotionally invested in these characters, and the one character you truly have a relationship with is stripped away from you. It creates a sense of loss and grief in the player. Titanfall 2 is an incredibly well-written game, but I think the worst part of the game is probably Jack Cooper himself. He doesn't provide a lot to the story besides being the player character, and his voice lines are very short and bland, even though he's voiced by the Matt Mercer, like the guy from Monsters University that everybody knows. A lot of Cooper's voice lines throughout the game provide some small comedic elements, but other than that, they don't provide much to the actual story. Again, going back to Lastimosa's death scene, he doesn't really say anything. Lastimosa just dies in front of him and there's no dialogue from him whatsoever. There are a lot of these moments that make Cooper feel hollow, and it feels like the developers didn't give him any defining personality traits. Another section that makes Cooper feel hollow is the scene where BT is being gunned down by Sloan after they've been captured, but to me this is actually one of the highlights of the game. Like I mentioned before, it's this moment where Cooper narratively is at his lowest, but after he's given the smart pistol, the player feels like they're invincible. It provides an interesting emotional contrast between the strength of the player and the weakness of Cooper. It's an emotional moment of quote unquote losing BT, and it really stuck out to me while playing the game. And now, the year is 2016. Steve is ready, Respawn is ready, and EA is ready to publish the game to audiences. But the question is, when do they do it? How about January for winter break? Says one employee. How about June for the summer break? Says another. No. How about we release it right in between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare? The game was a commercial flop. It only sold 4 million units compared to Titanfall 1's 10 million. Apparently the release date was planned much earlier in development and they just got unlucky with the timing. But the timing of the release is ultimately what killed Titanfall 2's chances of being a financially successful game. It was a critical success with an 89 overall score on Metacritic, but the game's critical success wasn't enough to overcome its poor release date. One review from Forbes by Eric Kane says, quote, Titanfall 2 is one of the best first-person shooters in years, and, quote, the single-player campaign alone is good enough to justify the purchase price, unquote, but it wasn't enough to motivate players to buy Titanfall over games like Battlefield and Call of Duty, which were already established franchises. And although Eric Kane left a glowing review of the game, other critics were not as enthused about the campaign. Cassidy Moser from Shack News gave it a 7 out of 10, saying, quote, good storytelling starts with the rule, show don't tell, whereas Titanfall was quick to tell you how important the relationship was. I will admit the dialogue is a little direct, telling the player much of what they need to know, but in my opinion, it was probably the best way they could have explained the story without a copious amount of cutscenes. Moser also says the gameplay missions can be boring, which they are narratively uninteresting at times, but the gameplay and level design to me are good enough to compensate for that. Overall, not bad reception for the first story in this franchise, but unfortunately, due to the lack of financial success, it would be the last Titanfall game ever released. Until Apex Legends was released, in which the entire world of Apex was built around Titanfall. Like I mentioned before, Cuban Blisk is important for this game because he's the one organizing it. That final invitation to become an Apex Predator was also an invitation to join the Apex Games, which is the Battle Royale setting where Apex takes place. So now that Titanfall is basically done, there's a lot to take away from the game and some important quirks of narrative design that could be really helpful for future developers. The first one I think of is the environmental storytelling the game provides about the IMC. These environments, although taking place in factories most of the time, truly represent what the IMC stands for and what their motivations are. The factory section where Cooper is running through all these pre-built homes shows the IMC's desire to control the building of homes. Homes are one of the basic facets of life, and the IMC wants to control as much of people's lives as possible. They're basically like a more dystopian Amazon. Another useful element is the use of narrative contrast in the story. The use of contrast in the smart pistol section is a great way to make the player feel powerful while also feeling uncomfortable. I'm reiterating myself, but again, in the final moments where BT dies, but Cooper saves the world is another contrasting section that invokes an emotional response from the player. This contrast is a great tool, and I think Titanfall utilizes it well. The last thing I want to touch on is the connection between gameplay and narrative elements. As I described early on, the use of fire and rockets really reflects Kane's personality as a fighter. Fire is wild and unpredictable, just like Kane. He is a drug addict, and a lot of his personality comes from being erratic, which is perfectly represented by the fire. Ash is another great example of this. Her Titan uses a sword and portals to fight. Using a sword to fight requires great coordination and skill, which reflects Ash's character really well. It's these little details which make Titanfall 2 a great game and a great experience. There's so much content packed into this 6-hour game, and it really stands out from other games in the genre. It's a game that many remember fondly of and was a pioneer in the movement shooter genre. Without Titanfall, we wouldn't have games like Apex Legends, The Finals, or even games like Ultra Kill. It's one of the greatest games in the FPS genre for its gameplay alone, and yet it still manages to tell a compelling story that has had a lasting impact on the industry. A part of me wishes that they will come out with a Titanfall 3 eventually, but anything with the moniker TF3 has no chance of happening. So a little side tangent, I was looking at reviews for this game and came across this post on Common Sense Media. I don't want to criticize anyone's parenting skills or police anyone's decisions, but at 9 years old, I could barely play Mario when I was 9, let alone Titanfall. I was playing Minecraft on my dad's phone. How can a 9-year-old even have the brain capacity to play this game? I didn't hear any cussing, that's just a straight up lie.